this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about a hard truth about the tabletop role-playing game industry. I'll give you the facts, and then we're going to get to the hard truth of it. And this is all in context of Dungeons & Dragons. So let's get, there's some hard truths that are being learned right now within the tabletop role-playing game space. So if you guys aren't aware, there's a podcast which you can watch right here on YouTube. And actually, it's not just a podcast. Like, they actually show their faces on screen. So what they're doing is they're creating a video and then pulling off the audio to make a podcast. It's really a video show. It's exactly what I do, video commentary, and they're just pulling the audio off to make a podcast. I don't think it's really a podcast at all. But there's a show called Mastering Dungeons. It's absolutely fantastic. It's done by Sean Merwin and Teos Abadia, and both these guys worked on a D&D canon hardback, so they are D&D canon authors. And actually, Sean Merwin is actually in the industry today. He works for Ghostfire Games with James Hayek, and they're connected to Dale Kingsmill as well. And they do a video commentary show as well on YouTube. Ghostfire Games. It's worth watching. All right, let's stay focused. And so Teos Abadia and Sean Merwin just did a great segment on their latest Mastering Dungeons, and they said Jason Buhlman, who is essentially the top designer, the design lead on Pathfinder, published his own adventure for Pathfinder through the traditional publishing method, right? And right now the traditional publishing method is really through DriveThruRPG. That's the lowest barrier, right? And he published it, and he published an adventure for Pathfinder. Okay, so this is the lead designer on Pathfinder publishing his own one-off standalone adventure for Pathfinder, and so he has all the experience necessary. He has all the exposure necessary. Like, you're not going to find a lot of designers within tabletop role-playing games with more exposure than Jason Buhlman. He's one of the top designers with the most talent and the most exposure, right? And especially on the OSR side, I consider him an OSR game designer. I consider Pathfinder an OSR game, right? We can have that discussion. I've had that discussion, right? So he's out there, and he created this adventure and could not make it profitable. Could not pay the artists everything that they deserved, and himself everything that he should have gotten for pay. And so this is the top designer making a adventure for the number two tabletop role-playing game in the world, right? And the adventure could not be profitable. Now, what does that tell us? What is the hard truth? Here's the hard truth. Okay, I'm going to list them off. Hard truth number one: the tabletop role-playing game industry is not real. The tabletop role-playing game is a hobby. There is a tabletop role-playing game creation hobby. It will not sustain a family. It will not sustain people with actual, it's not real, right? And I think right now, you have companies that are stood up and that look like real companies within the tabletop role-playing game space, but many of them, like their spouses or somebody they care about, is supplying their medical, right, and their side gigging, or they're funded by rich parents. Like, I don't actually think you can literally feed a family with what you can make in the tabletop role-playing game industry. If the top designer outside of D&D with the top game outside of D&D cannot reliably make profit on an adventure, that industry is not real, right? So the tabletop role-playing game industry is not actually an industry. It masks or raids as an industry. It's a creation hobby with a lot of vanity projects. I think that's the reality of it. And it's sad because a lot of people think that it is a real industry, get into it expecting to feed themselves and their family, and are not able to, right? And that's terrifying. That is really bad. The second thing is, Dungeons & Dragons, in my humble opinion, is not a game. It is not part of the tabletop role-playing game industry. Dungeons & Dragons is its own industry, right? And it is viable, and it is profitable, not because it's a tabletop role-playing game, but because role-playing experience. So you can make profit on a tabletop role-playing game experience product, one of them in the world, which is Dungeons & Dragons. It's the only one where you can actually feed a family, right? And to be clear, the only reason that is viable is because Dungeons & Dragons literally has the protection of, it has made canon to itself an absolutely massive profit engine, which is Magic the Gathering, right? And Magic the Gathering made sure that Dungeons & Dragons was bought when it needed protection back in the late 90s. And then, well, it was bought for profit. It's been massive. The purchase of Dungeons & Dragons for $60 million has turned out to be one of the most profitable purchases ever because Lorraine Williams did her job, right? So it didn't need to be protected. It was bought for value. I want to make that clear. And then basically, and then Dungeons & Dragons is not part of the tabletop role-playing game industry, in my opinion. It is part of the tabletop role-playing game experience industry, which there is one product of, which is Dungeons